Well, my contribution to Palestine probably is that I don't keep my mouth shut. My name is Samia Halaby, and I was born in 1936 in December to my mother and father. Futuni Abdel-Noor Atallah was her name, her maiden name, and my father is Asad Saba Halaby. I'm the third child. I had two older brothers. Sami Halaby was the eldest, and Fuad Halaby. And after me came my little sister, Nahida Halaby. I was born in Jerusalem as all of us siblings were. I was born at a hospital, I don't remember which name. And we lived in Jerusalem. We moved out of Jerusalem when I was about 3-4 years old, and went to live in Jaffa because my father's business was centered around Jaffa. And my memories of that period of time, preschool, school, just after school, has to do with a combination of Jaffa and Jerusalem, because the entire family lived in Jerusalem. Both my father's family and my mother's family are Jerusalem families. And so we drove up there every weekend. My father would put us in a car and we'd drive up to Jerusalem. And the families were very close. And I remember running around with the cousins from both sides. And by the time I was talking about, when I was 6, 7, 8, our families had moved out of the old city and had established themselves in Atamon in Jerusalem. And it was the homes that were new, that were built by my uncles, were very near, let's say, the beginning of farmlands. So I remember we'd get together and run all over the farmlands and through trees and orchards. And of course, they're planted, organized. And my cousins and we were very close. We had an unusual situation where my father's sister, Millie Halaby, married my mother's brother, Hanna Atallah, and so there were 4 other kids who were so close to us, practically brothers and sisters. And Munir Atallah was my one of those very close cousins, who then later became an important businessman in Amman. I began to go to school around age 5, and we were sent in Jaffa to a British school called Tabitha Mission School. And I remember the time, I remember what it felt like at that time. The friends I had, of course, it was a girls' school. And next to us were several other schools. This was a Christian school run by the British. And we students seemed to feel a certain, what should I call it, not enmity, but it was them and us kind of situation. And we loved making fun of them, them who were British, but in expression of our anger. And it was an interesting time and an interesting school. And Jaffa at the time, I remember it as being very beautiful, very open. I remember religious differences didn't seem to make a difference to the social life. I remember the Muslim women who were my mother's friends. They would wear veils in a very high fashion way. I have a very clear memory of a beautiful young woman stopping to talk with my mother, and she was wearing a yellow chiffon scarf, very high fashion. And And I remember the trees and the beautiful flowers and the sea in Jaffa. I remember as a child going often to the sea with my sister and others. We'd ride. There was a woman who took care of us. She'd take us on the bus and we'd go to the ocean. So the people at school, I remember my best friend at the time was Nuha Salib, and her friend was Davina Salib. And that was all in Jaffa. I don't remember my teachers' names very much. But I remember some of the funny little stories that happened, but I don't want to make this interview too long. So, well, one of the things that always I don't know, there must have been a shelter in the basement of the school we went to. By the way, we've gone to visit the school. And my first trip back to visit the school was really quite an amazing story. But in the basement of one of the buildings was a very empty space. And we had this myth among us that there was an owl, a scary owl that lived there. And so we would slowly go open the door, peek in. The boldest of us would go in a bit, and then we'd scream with laughter and run out. But it was a good time. It was before I became aware of the pending war and troubles and the attacks. I would often draw and paint on my own, and it was a very important thing for me. And I remember making my own brushes from chicken feathers, but that's not because I didn't have brushes, but the fun of making your own brush out of chicken feathers. And my sister and her friends often came to me to draw outlines for them, which they colored, and then we'd cut them up and make collage. So I did a lot of artwork when I was young. And in fact, I have some of my grammar books from Beirut, which have little trees. I had a favorite date tree that I would do, because you see a lot of date trees in Palestine. My father's story is very interesting. When he was very young, his name is Asad Halaby, Asad Samia Halaby, as I said in the beginning. And when he was very young, he told me stories about his youth. In fact, my memoir begins with his life stories. And he remembers his father and life before his father died. When his father died, my father, became the breadwinner of the family, and he was 12, and he had to be pulled out of school. And that was a bitter memory for him. He had to, he always looked at us, he's educating us, he's paying for our education, but he's always reminded of the bitterness of having to give up his own education. And he went on the streets selling bread that his mother baked, and his mother was a servant in the American colony. And I remember he talked about an American Indian they brought with him, which to me was the most tragic story I'd ever heard. And he was a very old man. You know, imagine this American Indian taken out of his environment here in America, thrown in Jerusalem, all by himself. I guess he was a servant to the Americans. So then he started, from one thing to the other. He used to describe himself as an Azar. He said, you wouldn't want to know me when I was a kid, Kunet Azar. So slowly he built up his business out of zero. The most wonderful story he told me about his life was that he was the first, an American professor came from America with an American rich man who wanted to go to the Soviet Union. So there weren't any roads, and that must have been 1925, something like that. And my father would have been about 20 at the time. And they told him, look, if you drive us to Iran, you can keep the car. So he drove them to Iran, to Tehran. He went and he took the car they brought him, and he went to the metalsmith. And the metalsmith put a lot of gas tanks all around the car, attached them to the car, and then he filled them all with gas, gasoline, put the two guys in, and off they went to Iran. And from Tehran, he drove them up to the Soviet border. At which time, I think this is the most interesting story, the Soviets at the border says, the professor can come in, and my father can come in because he's a worker, but the businessman is not allowed in. So he drives him back to Tehran, and he drives back to Jerusalem with his car, whatever gas he filled in Iran. Then he gets the tanks off, and the old cars had jumpers on the side. Runners. And he started the first service to Gaza, to Gaza from Jerusalem. He said, I had so many clients, I had to tie a rope around the car with all the people standing on the jumpers. Anyway, my father made his living that way.
He was an entrepreneur.
Yeah, he started from zero, less than zero in a way. But he also told me about the hunger there was during the First World War there in Jerusalem. A lot of people suffered from famine. There was a serious famine in Jerusalem. Maybe your parents talked about it too. My mother was one of the gentlest, sweetest persons on earth. And so she cooked, she had help in the kitchen, and I helped in the kitchen. I learned some things, but it was not the center of my life or of hers. With my mother, what I remember most was the active social life that took place. There were always friends and family, and people came in unannounced. There was this sisterhood of women who knitted and sewed together and gossiped together and so on. And she spent a lot of time with her sister and mother, took us there. Jerusalem was very special when we went together. And I remember my grandmother's home in Jerusalem. My grandmother was Maryam Atallah. Well, originally Maryam Zachariah, married to Abd al-Nur Atallah. And my grandmother had about 12 or 13 births. They didn't all live, but most of them did. So my mother had many siblings. Two of them, one became a lawyer, Hanna Atallah, and one became also a lawyer, and I think got into the Jordanian government, Anton Atallah. And my father's sister was also an important role model. Her name was Samia Halaby, and Sultani started a business in Jerusalem very early on, in the early 40s, and it was called Dar al-Kutub, and then it moved to Amman. So Dar al-Kutub in Amman, under her tutelage, became a meeting place of thinkers and intellectuals. But then, living in Palestine at that time, it began to be clear that things were not smooth, and we began to hear gunshots, and I remember collecting bullet heads on this huge balcony next to our house, which was really the roof of half of the building my father had bought, and his business was below. And to continue his business was, after he developed, he started importing tires and cars. And so he was selling, he had franchises for selling lots of different things, but Goodyear tires and Rover cars were the basic ones. I remember the wedding of one maternal uncle while we were in Palestine, and what I remember was mostly huge tables full of food, dish after dish, with everybody going crazy preparing. My memories of the get-togethers with my grandmother is they're embroidering, they're chatting, they're talking with each other. But the most wonderful stories told to me was the village woman who used to come and take care of us, but I forgot them.
Yeah.
I went to school in Jaffa. I started when I was 5 and it ended when I was 12, the year we left. And my memory of it was, I had good friends. It was just typical very comfortable. Until towards the end, when we started seeing friends not showing up because someone died in the family. One of the strong memories of the time is I was anemic, and so they would let me out of school. I'd go home, I'd get fed 2 eggs, 2 egg yellows with sugar, and then I'd go back to school. So now I remember the courses that I hated most was English spelling, and they were very harsh on us. You know, I looked back as an adult at some of my workbooks and I thought I got 8 and 9 words out of 10. Why were they giving me such a bad time? But that was the course that I hated most of all. I remember hearing all the gunfire at night, and then in the morning it would be quieting down. I'd go out and collect the bullet heads to show my father, because he tried to be in the resistance. And I also remember a night he was off to Syria or Egypt. They were trying to make arrangements to get help, and my mother was alone with us, and the fighting broke out on the street where we lived very close in Jaffa, very close to the port. And it was terrifying for my mother. And then there was a certain historic explosion that took place in Jaffa, and I'm sorry I don't have dates, but it's something I've looked up and it's written down. The Jews of that time, I mean, there were Jews, not Israelis then. The Zionist Jews who were trying to settle and fighting us, they're probably the gang members, the Haganah and those gangs, had parked a car full of explosives next to a place where there was a meeting taking place, and a lot of people were injured. And from what I saw was when finally a batch of men came running up the stairs with my father, and blood all over the place, and being shut off into a room so that they could take care of him. And apparently it wasn't a deep wound, but he had insisted on taking others to the hospital, so he bled profusely. But before that, about the British exploitation and oppression, I remember something very clearly. My father had become a successful businessman by then, and he had been prepping this new building near the port for us to move into, but we had been living in an apartment in another building that he had bought. And one day late in the afternoon, he received notice that the British were planning to commandeer this new house he had been remodeling. So he decided that a fait accompli on his part would prevent their theft. So from 4 o'clock, he came in with lots of men and boxes, and I remember being hustled with my sister to our bedroom, and the door closed on us, and the next morning I woke up in the new house. So it's like this kind of dramatic shifting in our life was beginning to take place. Then we were closer to the school at that point, and I remember that then the students began to thin out, and we'd hear news that was unclear, because it came through another student, that her father had been killed or had this or that had happened. So my brother, however, remembers the Jews of the time coming down in their tanks to our street, and there was quiet and peace, and they'd stop at the top of the street and they would just spray. So they would start trouble, killing anybody in sight. Well, the day our family left Jaffa, my father came, and things had gotten really very bad. And of course, I was only 12 at the time. I didn't really know how bad. And so I was told, pack up only what you need, because we're returning soon, but we're going to Lebanon. And he took us to the airport. He came with us, and we flew from Lid Airport to Beirut. It was spring, but I don't have written down the date. He wanted to rescue some of his possessions, some of his goods, because he had a branch in Lebanon at the time. But he wasn't, but the need for transportation out of Jaffa, the massacre in Jaffa was pushing the Yafawi's into the sea. So they really needed the boats. So the boat he had hired to take his goods out, he immediately gave it to load people who needed to get out. The person who tells the best story, narrative about that, is Tamam al-Akhal, with her painting and her narrative, she and her husband, about exactly what happened in Jaffa. We didn't know that we weren't coming back. And we were hopeful we'd be coming back, and my father was going back, and he did. So, but the memorable feelings came after, when in Beirut the men would get together and be talking. And to me, I remember those nights very, very clearly. It's as though they were very painful to listen to the men talking. And for years, anybody who had mentioned politics, I didn't want to hear it. I would leave the room. But then I adjusted. I became more political than he had been. And now the way I am politically is totally unforgiving. I have no forgiveness for what happened to us. All of Palestine is occupied to me, and all of Palestine has to come back, and it has to come back and be Arab and led by Arabs. So my artwork, my life, everything I have done as a Palestinian is bet on that. I will not shut up about that. And so I hope I don't get you in trouble.
No.
But afterwards, years afterwards, I realized that what bothered me about the sounds I was hearing is that I heard it only years after, maybe 40 years after. I began to hear them talking, not the logic of politics, but I heard them wailing, or, it's like so much anguish was in their voices. And that's what was disturbing. We stayed all together 3.5 years. And it was a time that there was a revolutionary uprising. Where was it? Morocco, or I tried to look it up. Where?
Algeria.
Algeria, yeah. Maybe. And I know that we were sent to something called the British Syrian Training College, my sister and I. And they were, I remember my mother had to. One day, once we were late getting into the school year, 4 days, and they wanted to hold us back for a year, and my mother had to go fight them. So they were really obnoxious in how much they thought they controlled our lives. But the most obnoxious thing is they'd close the door. So the school is surrounded by a high wall. The big doors would be open, we'd be in, and they'd close the door. And when the uprising began, the young people in Beirut wanted to sympathize, and they'd come and try and get us out of the school, and there was no way the school was going to let us out to a demo. But I remember we created havoc inside the school at the time because they wouldn't let us out. We went on our own job, we refused to study. The teacher would come up to the classroom with those benches in those times, they would get down and up. We just keep banging them until she had to leave. My mother, she and her friends immediately formed committees to receive material, to distribute and to help and to go work among them. So I didn't really know the details till later in life. Beirut was a lot of fun, by the way, because it was so beautiful at the time, which is too bad that it had to go through war, a real tragedy. It was real city life, and I had a great friend at school called Hasna, and at the school I remember fighting with another Palestinian kid who was black, and how we tore each other's uniform. and we all hid outside at a part of the school where the teachers wouldn't see us. And then a few hours later, we were back in sympathy. I was stitching her uniform back together again, and the other students were protecting us so the teachers wouldn't know what we did. But you know, it was an open-hearted atmosphere with the other students. At first, though, it was very difficult to switch schools and be in a new place, but not as difficult as switching to America. Here, I came to America, and my sister's reaction was to withdraw. She curled up with books and read all the time. I kept trying to go out and meet people and friends that I had in the street where we lived and at school, but it was a hard period. The first 2.5 years were difficult. And it's hard period not because it was economically hard, it was psychologically hard, culturally hard. I remember my first year here in the Midwest, I had a reaction, a physical reaction. I had I don't know what you call them, hives, a rash. I had a rash all over. I missed the ocean. We landed in New York, and my father had purchased a car, a little Buick, and his plan from what he had thought in Beirut was to drive across the country and live in Oregon. And so we started driving out of New York, and halfway there, we ran into a cousin. He ran into one of his nephews, and we started talking, and we were tired, and he said, I have an apartment, Cincinnati is great, why don't you stop here? So we took the apartment, and until my father, then he decided to stay. He bought a house, and so we were in Cincinnati on Teakwood Avenue, and we were supposed to go to a high school that people told my father was fast and not appropriate for two very naive Palestinian girls. And so he sent us to a neighboring neighborhood that was outside the city limits and had to pay for us to go to what was North College Hill High School at the time. And you know, Palestinians of the age we were are indeed naive. When I went back to Palestine and met students for the first time at Beirut University, I could not believe their amount of sincerity and sweetness and open-heartedness they had. And I began to think, you know, stealing Palestine from us in those days must have been like taking candy from children. Because I had, by the time I returned to revisit again, I had spent many years teaching in the American school university system. But that we were in Cincinnati. My sister and I went to North College Hill High School. My brothers went to university. One went to Texas and one went to Michigan. And so for the first time, it was just a reduced family. It was a hard time for my mother because this social ambience she was used to with all her friends and family was gone, and she was all by herself, and she had to do a lot of work taking care of a whole house and cooking and getting used to the ambience there, and it was difficult. America and nations generally don't take immigrants open-heartedly. If they bring a bank account, they're accepted. So by the time he finished doing all that, he practically ran out of money. But at the same time, he had a business arrangement with Goodyear from before he came. So they promised to give him, you know, a franchise in one part of Cincinnati. So he was selling novelty items, gifts, but also recapping tires. He was selling tires, but was very hard making ends meet. He used to like to say, I was a big fish in a small pond, now I'm a small fish in a huge pond, but reflecting how hard it was for him. And it was hard. After a while, we could feel the crunch economically. I didn't know what to want to study, and my mother finally, after much confusion, said, well, you've always been making art, why not study art? So I told her, I just want to be able to make my living and be independent, and so I studied design instead of fine art. And so I registered at the University of Cincinnati School of Fine Arts in the co-op program. And that was great for me and great for my father, who wasn't able to make all ends meet at that time very well, and we had to save. So the co-op program meant by the time I became a sophomore, I would go to work. They would find a job for us. So I'd work 7, 8 weeks, then go to school 7 weeks, then get a week vacation. And that went on for 4 years. The first year was full-time student, but it was a good experience, all of it all together, the teaching and the friends we had at the time. And I remember the first one I worked in, this boss called me in and tried to tell me about how he does work with this and that. And now, in hindsight, I think he must have been an agent, you know, mukhabarat. What's mukhabarat in English?
Intelligence.
Yeah, because I remember some of the things that I had to proofread had to do with intelligence. It referred to one family living on my street who were seen as being leftists, and I remember passing by the house and looking at it and wondering. All of it was very new to me. Yeah. But he wasn't. He wanted to question me, but he wasn't particularly friendly. I don't remember their names. They were very small printing shops. Mm-hmm. We collated things in the back room, you know, collating, yeah, and proofreading and designing a few things, and that was supposed to contribute to our experience. And my father, his first lesson, now we're in a new country, you have to forget everything and just open your heart and go with it. But you know, over time, Faisal, we may have opened our hearts and wanted to go with it, but you know, basically, I think over my lifetime, I've experienced a lot of racism here. But you know, the Midwest was much kinder than the East Coast. You know, the professional class in the East Coast is really very nasty. But I think the Midwest has a more working class atmosphere, and people were more accepting and friendly. But I do remember some strange things when I was young. I remember someone wanted to come and interview the family because here was the family from the quote-unquote Holy Land. And so my mother didn't seem to want to talk to them, so she said, you can interview my daughter. And they interviewed me, and then when I read the interview, I noticed that one of the things they were pointing to was my olive skin, and it was like a whole new world for me, this attention to the color of your skin. And I found it very disturbing. I couldn't understand, you know, there was a content in it that was totally new to me. So when I finished college, I tried to work for a year, and then it didn't work. And one of my friends and I decided we're going to go to Michigan State University together, which we did. And it was a graduate school, and we went for 1 year and earned a master's. I remember at that time there were professors from New York. It was the abstract expressionist period. There were guest artists in Michigan. One professor was Mr. Hendrickson, who was very supportive of what I did and tried to make me understand that, you know, to look carefully at what I did, and that he liked what I was doing and that it would be important in the future. There was an artist from New York they brought in whose name was Boris Margot as a visiting artist. I remember his presence at the time. And eventually I returned to Cincinnati, worked for a year, and I decided, you know, this working in design shops was not really very good, or what I really wanted to do. So I went back to discovered what it takes to become a university professor. Went back to the Indiana University and earned a Master of Fine Art degree, which makes it easier to teach. There, my professors were a printmaker whose name was Pozzati. There was two great art historians that really influenced me, and there was a painter whose name was James McGarrell, whose image was totally different from mine. And at that time, I really wanted to be an abstract painter. I did not want to do illusion. He was an illusionist, and he made images of interiors of homes that were like full of material possessions. They had their charm, but not the charm that I felt I wanted to express. And so actually during my second year at Indiana, I had the experience for the first time in my artistic career of feeling that I had caught like I hit a gold mine. You know, I didn't think of it as a gold mine, but I felt like I had touched on something creative, and I pursued it, and I made a whole series of paintings that were very flat, pure color surfaces. And that went on for my graduate year and my 1 or 2 years after graduate school. Well, I decided really very quickly, while in school even, that actually before I went to Indiana and wanting to be a professor, I found out that what I really wanted was to be a painter full-time. And to be a painter full-time, I needed money to survive. And I didn't see any way to earn money through design. And so I planned I would teach, I would live frugally, and I would save until I could quit teaching. Actually ended up being a 17-year stint of teaching at the university level. My first teaching position was at the University of Hawaii, of all places. I still have, it was so unusual. They were so nice. I still have a picture of me that one of them thankfully took, arriving at the airport wearing a suit, the suit I had bought especially for my graduate show examination at Indiana University. And I'm full of lace, you know. They brought flower lace. And here I am in high heels, having floated across the country with my suit and all these flower lace. And they had me stay with one of their professors. They were just unbelievable in how welcoming they were. It was as though, you know, it was still an early community there. And from there, I began to feel like I'm really so far away from Palestine, so far away from everything. If I wanted to forget the world, I would stay there. It's really lovely. But I couldn't forget my history and my past, and so I moved out of Hawaii and got a job. My second job was with the Kansas City Art Institute. And I taught there I started their program there, their beginning program. And it was a good experience to have that under my belt. And from there, I taught at Indiana. I went back to Indiana University. I taught at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Then I got a job at Yale University. And I stayed there for 10 years. And that experience at Yale had its good attributes and its horrible attributes, because I could see at Yale you're right up to the face of some of the worst attributes of the U.S. ruling class. And the thick racism I felt emanating from most of my fellow professors and from the administration was really very unpleasant and very backward. I mean, the school had become very decadent while I was there. The teaching, maybe I hear now that it's improved vastly, but I have no good feeling about that time. And we had our parting of the ways after 10 years, after they promised me it would be 10 years. But note the similarity between 10 years and 10 years. We arrived at 10 years, and one of the professors there, who was a Zionist and hated my guts for being Palestinian, decided he's going to get rid of all the women. And indeed they did, and I was first to go, and it was very ugly the way they did it. So I don't have a good feeling about them. I never will. Then I went through the grievance procedure. They were so scared. They put someone on the committee that, I forget his name. He was very important in the US government, and he was teaching at Yale. And I think essentially I won the grievance procedure. You can have your job back if you prove you're the world's expert at what you're teaching. I think now they'd have to prove to me they're a university of any level worth teaching at, you know. So the separation from Yale was the best thing that happened to me. I became a full-time professor. It took me 10 years to recover from the negative mentality academia puts in your brain. You know, to become truly intellectual, to think for yourself, to look at history, you have to be independent of academia. You have to like see the world for what it is. You have to be able to look at all of art history, not just Western art history. You have to see it all with respect. So, you know, that period in my life was enlightening. 4 students committed suicide while I was there, in the art school, not other places. I remember I was on a committee where they had masters of colleges, you know. They would say, oh, we lock the doors to the roofs during examination. That tells you the atmosphere that exists there. So,
so have you been back to Yale since?
No, I will not go. There's no reason to go. They want to send a letter of apology, maybe I'll consider it, but forget it otherwise. It's not worth my effort. Well, I often wonder about if the first programming I did on the Amiga might have been the most important work I've ever done as a painter. That's because I broke barriers there. I was putting in one function, or if you say one loop, commands that ran not only the visual change, but also the sound. And it's based on, the computer made it possible for me to imitate reality, not in just abstractly in a stable image, but in an image that shifted.
Dynamic.
Kinetic, dynamic. So, you know, when people think of movement, we're thinking of a lens-based movement. A camera, video, or film still has a lens, and it sees an imitation of the 3-dimensional perspective discovered in painting. You know, it sees perspective. It does not see, so it does not record rhythm. It does not generalize to see what was understood yesterday, today, or next hour. So it lacks that. But to have that kind of imagery that's abstract, that records the motion of reality, the relativity of space, the passing of time, the rhythm, all of these things, and at the same time give you the sound of something you look at and something that might happen behind you, the sound that isn't belong to a shape, and the sound of shapes. So to me, to put all that in a little program that ran for 4 minutes might have been the most important thing I did as an imitation of reality. But I also, by the way, do many different kinds of artwork, and I separate them from each other. I say I have 3 things I do, and I don't mix them because I think they harm each other. I do, in my painting, is attempts to be on an international level. I claim all the history of world art from beginning of time to now as my heritage. I don't limit myself to Palestine. The bourgeoisie might want me to limit myself. They might want to do pockets, but I'm going to jump over all of them. Ancient African art, ancient Indian, they're all mine. If there's a library and I can see them, I would be stupid not to accept them into my world of understanding. So I take all of history and I want to make paintings that take all of the visual information that makes painting and move it forward. I'm not interested in this subject matter that is in postmodernism. I'm not here telling a verbal story. I'm not here telling you a story of religion. I'm not telling you a story of the profundity of dual meanings to 5 words that don't resemble each other. You know what I mean? It is visual. This is about the world we see and the language of the things we see. And that's, I consider it research and exploration, and I don't consider it a decoration for rich people's homes. I'd consider it as a human research into the power of the language of the visual, which has served us. The other kind of work I do is political for Palestine, and that's divided into two. One is documentary drawing, that is like the series of olive trees I did and what the Israelis have done to attack our economy by destroying them. And one is the documentation of the Kfar Qasim massacre, which was a huge project in my life and a very important one, and my total admiration and love of the Palestinian working class who labor and labor and labor and bring up their children and persist and continue to be really good people. I think that that was a very important project, but not in the way that the computer was. It's a different kind of thing. Abstraction is researching something that is at the leading edge of knowledge in picture making. And that's not Kfar Qasim. It is not there to, it is not yet ready to document something that is known in its quantities. It's there to teach us how to add words to the language of pictures. That language, which documents Kfar Qasim, was perfected after thousands of years of drawing, starting in China, moving on to India, the Arab world, and then the Italian painting and the Renaissance. It is perfected by the Renaissance, and that method of drawing can tell the story with precision, as much precision as we can give it in art right now. Abstraction wouldn't have that kind of precision yet. It's still in research. It started in 1999 with my visit to Kfar Qasim and my stay in Palestine for 3 months. And then I continued working on it, and then we did a show in Chelsea at the museum we opened especially for the Made in Palestine show. When the Made in Palestine show came down, we had a month left on our lease, so we had a few shows, and we showed pieces there. Then in 2012, I decided it, and I spent 6 months at the 50th anniversary period doing a website for the massacre. And then when 60-year anniversary came, I had felt always that I should do a book and give it concrete form. So I decided also to finish the project. So I spent 2 years, probably 2011 and 12, doing the final drawings, translating interviews, transcribing them from tape. A lot of work went into that book that wasn't drawing. Well, the people of Kfar Qasim were very pleased. I got criticized by some viewers of the show that we did in Dubai. Why did you do it in English? Why not in Arabic? And the Kfar Qasim people said, no, we want our story to go out to the world. We don't want it. We can translate to Arabic, but we want everybody to be able to read it. And then when we had it and the show received a lot of acceptance, and it will always be my forever gratitude to YAM Gallery for doing that show, artwork that was not for sale, just like behaving like a museum. Yeah. And then we showed it at the Beirut Museum, and they did a catalog, and the catalog, they did 1,000 copies of the catalog, and it went out like nothing. They had to reprint. And we had a big crowd, and Kfar Qasim people came and attended. So from Palestinians and Arabs, it received a lot of acceptance. We have yet to show it in the West. There was a collector who started wanting to collect my work when I was teaching at Yale University, but I already had my salary from Yale, so that wasn't key. Had a very, very hard time in New York, and I still do. I'm not accepted as an artist in New York. Being female, being olive skin, and being Palestinian does not make you And you know, I don't keep my mouth shut either, so that doesn't help. And I'm not going to, because then you lose your self-respect, and I fully think that you cannot lose your self-respect if you're really going to be a thinker and do good painting. So and New York is very, very difficult. I began to have my success by leaving the commercial world of the West and moving to, you know, I was accepted first of all in the Arab world by Suha Shuman at the Khalid Shuman Foundation in Amman. She showed me for quite a few years. She was very generous in buying my work. Then I had a gallery in Beirut, and then Ayyam. I had a reputation among artists in the Arab world. I had a reputation to some limited extent here in the Midwest more than here in New York. Well, my contribution to Palestine probably is that I don't keep my mouth shut. I express my political views. I am determined that I connect Palestine to my artwork. Wherever my artwork goes, Palestine goes with me. My hope for Palestine goes with me. My hope for Palestinian children will always be connected to my legacy. I would like to make a foundation that helps Palestinian children, which is very difficult to do given the atmosphere and the laws here in the US, but we are going to do our best with it. Well, I had a dream once of building my own home out of bottles and stones and mud, and and it never happened, so I regret not doing that. You know, there are many things you regret you didn't get to do, but basically I feel good. I have two things I really want to do. I want to rewrite the book on liberation art of Palestine, republish it with many more pictures of all my fellow Palestinian artists who did amazing work during the Intifada. The other thing I really want to do is write an essay making a formal analysis of geometric art in the mosques and palaces of the Arab world, because I see there a pictorial art that is historically significant that nobody's paid attention to. I want to make the formal analysis in terms of how the shapes fit into a rectangle, what the artist did, because I have that capacity. I understand the language of painting, and when we say painting, we're talking about pigment on canvas, but that the material I'm describing is not painting, but it's the same. Whether your clothes are made of cotton or linen doesn't matter. It's made out of inlaid marble, inlaid glass, inlaid wood, mother of pearl, and a lot of inlaid marble, sometimes with paint. It is the formal qualities of this mostly medieval period of Islamic art that I would like to isolate, identify, and analyze, and bring, make it clear to the world that this is a very important historic art. I want to be known as a painter and as politically ambitious for Palestine, as a Palestinian painter ambitious for Palestine.
What would you like to say? إيش بدك تحكي للفلسطينية في أنحاء العالم؟ بتحبي إيش تقولي لها؟
بحب أقول لهم أول إشي إنه أنا بحب الفلسطينية وبحب فلسطين كل احترام. بحبش العملاء أكيد، وأنا بدي أشوف الصمود لكل الفلسطينية يكون إشي مهم بداخلنا بقلبنا حتى نمشي إلى الأمام. وأنا متأكدة 100% إنه راح نرجع فلسطين. مش راح ترجع لأننا بدنا نضل نطلب من غيرنا تعالوا حرروا فلسطين. إحنا راح نحررها بإيدنا. ففلسطين بدها ترجع، وراح نكون حرين، وراح نتخلص من العدو البشع اللي هو واقف فوقنا، اللي عم بيعذبنا هلأ بكل نواحي الدنيا. بكل نواحي الدنيا في هجوم علينا. أكيد في غزة هلأ عم بتألموا كتير أكتر من ما أنا بتألم، أنا وياك عم نتألم هون، بس لازم دايما نكون مع بعض ودايما إلى الأمام ودايما عندنا قوة داخلية وثقة بحالنا وثقة بالجيل المستقبل، لأن أنا بشوفه كتير جميل وكتير عنده مواهب، ويعني إشي فظيع وحلو كتير. فلابد بعد شوي بفكر بأشياء غير، بس هلأ هدول الأفكار اللي دخلوا